Good morning, or well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mervyn and I'd like to welcome you here on behalf of the School of History at University College Cork. Let me just advise you at the outset that throughout the day, everything will be recorded. So please bear that in mind. You'll be reminded of this regularly. We need to keep a record of this for posterity. Well, okay, I'll keep my remarks quite short and to the point. Clearly, this is a landmark occasion as we're here to mark the complexities of negotiating the Anglo-Irish Treaty 100 years ago. It's not an exaggeration to note that the treaty played a pivotal role in patterning Irish politics and society for a prolonged period afterwards. After a decade of enormous change in Anglo-Irish affairs. Effectively, the island of Ireland, I think, went through a period of transformation during this decade and subsequently, but it fitted into a wider transformation in international affairs occasioned by the Great War and its unsettling effects. While the repercussions of the treaty may be much discussed, it seems to us here at UCC that as historians, our central goal should be to comprehend the entire nature of the negotiations themselves, and not just from Irish perspectives, but from British and other perspectives as well, to provide a far more diverse and realistic appreciation of what was at stake for all sides, interests, and positions involved. Thus, we wanted to illuminate the role of the individuals involved, the relationship between the delegations, the diverse interests represented, as they not alone carry the weight of their own respective interest groups, but also we want to consider how the negotiations were impacting on the configuration of Britain, Northern Ireland, and the British Empire, as well as the island of Ireland. The very occurrence of the negotiations between the Dáil and the British government was setting a precedent in its own right for the Empire Commonwealth. Now, the School of History here at UCC has a long-standing interest in the Irish Revolution, reflecting a very great depth of expertise in the field. I won't embarrass my colleagues except to say that a large proportion of the department has made contributions to the field, most notably with the Atlas of the Irish Revolution and the RTE documentary on the Irish Revolution. But there are many others here at UCC as well, in other disciplines, such as geography and politics, who have complementary interests. And let me say that as a School of History, we're fully committed to robust public engagement. And this is the first of UCC's Irish Civil War Centenary Programme, which will include collaborations with the Irish Examiner and with the Irish Military Archives, and a major digital humanities project on Cork's Civil War dead. It will also include a 3-part documentary with RTE, and finally, a 4-day national conference on the Irish Civil War in June. The national conference in June, we're very grateful to have got government support and approval for. I won't keep you long, except to draw your attention to the depth of expertise that we're drawing together over the next day and a half. The conference will deal with multiple dimensions to the Anglo-Irish Treaty: North-South relations, gender, constitutional implications, the Anglo-Irish relationship, sovereignty, democratic representation, and so on. It's remarkable how relevant these topics remain to us today. Our objective throughout is to recognize that there were and are diverse views on these matters, and there are different narratives, but they must all be recognized, included, and subjected to scholarly evaluation as part of providing a comprehensive account of the treaty negotiations, which, after all, are not just an Irish event. It was a British, imperial, and even an internationally significant event. Today, we will have 3 sessions, and it will end with a plenary from Professor Richard Toy, who will talk about Lloyd George and the British Cabinet perspective. That session will be introduced by British Ambassador Paul Johnston. Tomorrow, we will be pleased and honoured also to hear an address from Taoiseach Micheál Martin, who is a distinguished product of the UCC School of History himself and has written around the whole area of revolutionary change. Throughout the day, let me just ask you to feel free to submit questions to the speakers, but do it please through the chat function so that this can be moderated by the chairs. The school would like to acknowledge the generous support of Cork County Council, Cork City Council, and the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Culture, Gaeltacht, Sport and the Media, and their assistance, financial and moral, has been very important in assisting us here today. Finally, the school wants to acknowledge the descendants group of the Irish delegation who came up with the idea of the conference and were determined to have an inclusive and diverse conference that respected all players and delegations in the treaty negotiations, Irish and British, recognizing their common history and the impact it had on their families, as well as the respective states. The Descendants Group has an ambitious program of its own and is involved in a number of its own activities and publications. They are graciously participating here today and will be delivering their own papers and sharing sessions over the next day and a half with us. We're glad to have them on board. Their involvement greatly enriches the authenticity of this conference. So as scholars of the treaty, we expect to gain some invaluable insights from them, and we hope they won't find historical scholars too dispassionate, too detached, and harsh. I will now hand over the chair of our first session to Professor Caoimhe Brua. He's a retired mathematics professor of University College Dublin, the grandson of Terence and Muriel McSweeney and Cathal and Kathleen Brua. And he's a member of the descendants of the Irish delegation that were sent to Dáil Éireann, sent by Dáil Éireann to London in 1921. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mervyn, for the wonderful introduction. So just to reiterate, this session is being recorded and any questions should be through the chat box. So welcome to Negotiating the Negotiations, New Perspectives and Appraisals of the Anglo-Irish Treaty 1921 to 2021. This conference is an initiative by the descendants of a large number of people associated with the negotiations who travelled to London. Welcome to Cork, the city that led the Irish War of Independence, that in 2020 commemorated two Lord Mayors who made the ultimate sacrifice to make Ireland independent from the British Empire, Moss McCurtain and Terence McSweeney, my grandfather. Welcome to University College Cork, famous for Professor George Boole, founder of Boolean mathematics, the basis of computer analytics, because of which you can attend this conference anywhere in the world on your mobile phone. UCC is more famous for Sean O'Riordan, the musical genius who inspired the resurgence of our musical heritage. And UCC is also famous for the beautiful Honan Chapel, where my mother, Maura McSweeney, married my father, Rudy Brew, son of Cathal Brew, one of the people who didn't travel to London for the negotiations. This conference and the book that will follow early in the new year give something of the human stories behind the traumatic political bargaining. We have two speakers in this session who we will hear before opening for questions online through the chat box, Dr. Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéid and Dr. Sinéad McCoole. Dr. Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéid is a senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Sheffield. Caoimhe did her BA here in UCC's School of History, who we would like to thank for hosting the conference. Caoimhe then went to Queen's University Belfast for her MA and PhD. She has published on the history of the IRA in the post-revolutionary period, the history of childhood during and after the East Rising, and the history of political violence since the 19th century. Caoimhe is currently working on a history of emotions during the Irish Revolution. It's a sign of how far we have come that a UCC graduate working in the history department of a British university could give her talk as Gaeilge, but chooses to do so in English because this conference is being attended by people throughout the world. Dr. Nick Dháibhéid's talk today is titled Ending the Scrap from War of Independence to the Truce. Caoimhe, over to you.
Thank you, Cathal, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank our hosts at UCC, particularly John Borgonovo and Mervyn O'Driscoll, for the invitation to speak to you. I'm really pleased to be able to join virtually. It would have been better to have been there in person, but this is a good substitute. So what I was asked to do was to set the scene for the treaty negotiations, to give the audience an account of where we had gotten to in the War of Independence, how the truce had unfolded, and what were the principal issues to be resolved during the negotiations. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So on the 11th of July, 1921, the scrap, as IRA veterans tended to call it, paused. It seemed momentarily, and the picture that you see is of General Macready making his way into the Mansion House on the 8th of July 1921 for negotiations surrounding the agreement of this truce. The message that was sent out from General Richard Mulcahy, Chief of Staff of the Irish Republican Army, to all units read, in view of the conversations now being entered into by our government with the government of Great Britain, and in pursuance of mutual conversations, active operations by our forces will be suspended as from noon, Monday, the 11th of July. The truce was greeted with wild celebrations in parts of the country, bonfires, marching bands, and even some good-natured banter between IRA volunteers and their belligerents, notably the Black and Tans. Next slide, please. Dublin was reported as being calm rather than the scene of high excitement, although, as John Dorney has pointed out, the most immediate visible sign of the truce was the relative withdrawal of police and military cars and lorries from the streets. There's a rare example of some Black and Tans venturing out for a swim in the days after the truce was agreed. You'd see them with towels around their neck there. Now, many names have been given to the conflict, commonly dated from the 21st of January 1919 to the 11th of July 1921. The Anglo-Irish War, the Tan War, the War of Independence, the War for Independence, the Troubles, the Scrap, and many of those who made their name during it, whatever we call it, went on to illustrious political careers during the treaty negotiations and afterwards. And we will hear about some of those people later on. What I want to do in this paper is to bring everybody up to speed in terms of what the War of Independence was, what its main issues were. And I don't propose to give a narrative overview of the sequence of events that brought us from 1919 to 1921. I'm sure many in the audience will already be familiar with the principal events of that conflict, commonly held to have begun on the day the Solo Headbeg ambush coincided with the first meeting of abstentionist Sinn Féin TDs in the New Dáil Éireann. What I want to do instead is to look at some of the characteristics of the conflict through the prism of the deaths that occurred on this day, before moving to consider some of the major issues to be resolved in the negotiations. Now, the death toll of the Irish Revolution has been meticulously investigated and compiled by Eunan O'Halpin and Dahi O'Coroin in their book, The Dead of the Irish Revolution, providing an unrivaled account of the toll of the conflict where it mattered most in the lives that were lost. And it's interesting looking at the book, which I have here, and the relative weight of the book varies quite substantially year by year. At the outset of the book, the months pass by relatively quickly. In the middle, the pace slows considerably as a surge in the death toll means that more space needs to be taken to detail all of the bloodshed. It takes just 11 pages to get through 1919, the first year of the War of Independence. It takes 148 pages to get through 1920, and it takes 274 pages to get through 1921. So the first point that I want to make is to emphasize the relatively slow start the War of Independence had, even after the ambush at Solo Headbeg. The 1st of October, today's date, features relatively lightly. No deaths arising from the conflict occurred on the 1st of October 1916, 1917, 1918, or 1919, or in 1921, when the negotiations were about to begin. But on the 1st of October 1920, 3 deaths occurred. The first was that of John Connolly, a 25-year-old trade unionist and member of the Bandon Company of the Cork No. 3 Brigade of the IRA. He had been arrested the previous night and was taken to Bandon Military Barracks, from where his family were informed he was released. But just over 2 weeks later, his partially decomposed body was discovered at Castle Bernard Park, just outside the town. Also on the 1st of October, 80-year-old Sean Keane died in Ennistimon Workhouse, County Clare, of injuries caused by a dum-dum bullet fired by the British military the previous week. Keane had been working in a field when the volunteers of the Mid-Clare Brigade ambushed an RIC lorry on the 22nd of September, killing 6 policemen. And when, in the aftermath of that ambush, a British military lorry approached and fired, Keane was fatally injured. The last person to die on the 1st of October 1920 was 24-year-old Samuel Shannon from Skibbereen, a farmer's son, a Protestant who was shot by the IRA outside his family home after he and his father had repelled an attack by the IRA using just sticks. And he too died 2 weeks later of his injuries. So these 3 deaths, coming from roughly the midpoint of the War of Independence, underscore some important features of the conflict, which I want to briefly talk about. And we should note the patchy geographic nature of the hostilities, particularly in the early stages. So just as there is, it takes time for the War of Independence to really gather pace, in a similar way, it doesn't happen across the whole country at the same level at the same time. I don't need to remind an audience in UCC that the County of Cork was an especially active part of the country. Other counties like Clare or Tipperary were similar hotspots in the early phases, but declined somewhat over the second half of the conflict. Dublin, like Cork, was a perennial flashpoint. The highest concentration of British troops and the organisational nucleus of IRA GHQ meant that it provided ample scope for confrontation. But other counties were more quiescent early on or sparked into activity at later stages, helped along the way by the radicalising effects of British policy, especially after the winter of 1920, and by the travelling organisers sent out by GHQ to bring local units up to scratch. Much depended on local conditions, as the phrase went. The numbers in the local units, their appetite for action, their capacity to secure weapons. And this urge to obtain weapons drove a high proportion of the early IRA actions. Responsibility for securing weapons was devolved down to local units. They got no mileage out of going to GHQ and asking to be supplied with weapons. They were told you need to go and find them yourselves. And so they did source them themselves, raiding likely houses for shotguns and other revolvers. And this may explain partly why ex-servicemen seem to have been disproportionately targeted. More ambitious units set their sights on the relatively rich supplies in a police barracks. And although IRA GHQ did attempt to source weapons, to bring in large consignments of weapons, particularly from Europe in 1921, this was not altogether successful. It was a very slow process, and weapon and ammunition stores were running perilously low by June of that year, just before the truce was called. So local conditions varied, the geography of violence varied, and levels of activity also fluctuated over the period of the conflict. By the time of the truce, what had been previously calm counties in the Midlands and especially the west of Ireland were becoming more active, while after the disastrous attack on the Custom House in May 1921, the IRA in Dublin were themselves in a precarious state. And even as the killings in the rest of the country wound down after the 11th, in and around July 1921, violence in the northeast of the country, particularly in Belfast, ratcheted up again, with 22 people killed in intercommunal violence in and around the 9th of July. So that's the first point I want to make. Variation by at the level of geography and at the level of chronology in terms of how violence was experienced. The second point I want to make is about the texture of the conflict, and this is illustrated precisely by the 3 deaths which occurred on this day 101 years ago. People were killed in all sorts of settings, in the thick of action, by stray bullets, or in cold reprisal. Civilians were killed by the state, as with Sean Keane, shot by a stray exploding bullet as he worked in a field, and civilians were killed by the IRA, as with Samuel Shannon, shot at his gate after he'd fought off armed invaders the previous night. And overall, civilians accounted for 39% of the deaths from 1916 to 1921, the highest single category of victim. Could I have the next slide, please? At the other end of scale of engagements, from an assassination at a farmyard gate, the ambush in whose aftermath Sean Keane was killed at Rhinee in County Clare is a good example of the sort of innovative, highly organised and highly effective attack that the IRA became known for. And this was, by the time this occurred, this was the most substantial ambush involving a high numbers of IRA men, up to 60 or 70 volunteers, that had occurred up to that point. And local knowledge was key to success. The IRA knew, as did the people of the Rhinee district, that Crown forces were in the habit of making a patrol every Wednesday morning and prepared accordingly, using familiarity with the terrain of West Clare and its boreens, its furze bushes and its bendy roads to gain an advantage. And you can see a photograph of the ambush site with the various elements marked up, who was where, who was coming from which direction. This knowledge was clearly significant in planning an effective ambush. And the Crown forces involved at Rhinee also tell us something about how the War of Independence unfolded. 5 of the 6 police killed were old-timers in the Royal Irish Constabulary, those who joined the force before the War of Independence. Many had joined even before the Great War. And by that point, in the autumn of 1920, these old-timers were leaving fast, driven out by boycott, by ostracization, and by direct attack on or frequently off duty. The 6th policeman killed was 21-year-old Reginald Hardiman, an ex-serviceman from London who had joined the RIC as the force brought in reinforcements from England, dubbed the Black and Tans for their hybrid uniforms. And every policeman who was in that lorry was killed in the ambush. This was a significant success, a significant victory for the Mid-Clare Brigade. Following the initial attack, it was wayward shots from a British Army lorry, not police, an army lorry, that killed Sean Keane in the field. So the protagonists on the side of the Crown forces thus spanned long-serving Irish members of the RIC, British new recruits to the Black and Tan sections, and the regular British Army. Next slide, please. Which arm of the British state should take the lead in countering the IRA campaign was not always straightforward, and it was a political and a politicized decision. The term war was not favoured by the British government. It was civil disorder, a murder gang terrorising the population. These were the phrases that British ministers repeated constantly. As such, it was a police matter to be dealt with by the police, even a highly militarised police force such as the RIC. But it couldn't be dealt with by ordinary policing. It required massive reinforcements. It required the suspension of habeas corpus. It required internment camps. It required special legislation, and it required martial law, gradually extending across the whole of the country. In the aftermath of this ambush, Crown forces launched severe reprisals on the local population, burning houses in Milltown Malbay, in Lahinch and Ennistimon, and shooting dead 5 civilians. The reprisals policy, tolerated, even sanctioned at official level, gives us another window into how the War of Independence progressed. Collective punishment of the civilian population, including economic destruction of creameries and cooperatives, formed part of the British state response. This was not just some hotheads running amok, enraged by the deaths of their comrades, although that may have been part of it at times. It was also a deliberate strategy to make clear to civilians what the price was of silence and of safe houses. As conditions deteriorated across Ireland in the summer of 1920, normal justice ceased to function, along with the capacity of the British judicial system to apprehend and convict IRA members. Shooting known Sinn Féiners, as the phrase went, thus often ran alongside sacking and burning a town. Next slide, please. This cycle of violence, attacks on Crown forces, followed by shootings and burnings of towns, was a recurrent feature of the conflict, from Tuam to Balbriggan to Cork City. And reprisals were one side of the state terror which characterised the conflict. The more cold-blooded extrajudicial killings were another, as was the fate of John Connolly, the volunteer from Bandon, who was also killed on this day. Often these extrajudicial killings were euphemised as shot while trying to escape. A secret burial, as was the case with Connolly, was less common, at least on the British side. Reprisals, however, only worked up to a point. In a world of increasing connectivity, with active publicity and propaganda campaigns being carried out by the Republican administration, with foreign correspondents aplenty visiting Ireland and reporting firsthand on what they saw, the brutality of reprisals was very politically counterproductive and had a major impact on British public opposition to the campaign in Ireland, as well as on international opinion. And by this time, the financial cost of the war, of dealing with the counterinsurgency campaign, was significant. The conflict in Ireland tied up 80,000 troops across all branches of Crown forces and was estimated to cost the British state £20 million a year. And that's £20 million by 1921 standards. So a much more significant amount by the standards of today. So across the conflict, even as the pace or density of violence and as old opponents retired and new ones arrived, I just want to mention a few other issues before I turn to setting out some of the thorny problems to be resolved in the negotiations. So the first is the degree to which the military campaign on the Republican side was joined up with the political one. Now, the next slide, please. The relationship of Sinn Féin with the IRA, and without even touching on the complex position of the IRB within all of this, but even the relationship of Sinn Féin with the IRA was not altogether straightforward, nor yet was the relationship of the Dáil with the IRA. Certainly there was a large overlap of personnel. Many Sinn Féin TDs were IRA officer, many cabinet members were senior IRA figures, and many Sinn Féin and Dáil staff were members of Commemorations. However, the coincidence of the Solo Headbeg ambush occurring on the same day as the first meeting of Dáil Éireann gave the impression of cohesion and coordination where this was not always the case. The much delayed, haphazard and patchy efforts to get all IRA volunteers to swear an oath of allegiance to the Dáil, and by extension to the principle of civil government, also speaks to this. Volunteers had already sworn an oath to the Irish Republic. That was the oath they took when they enrolled in the IRA, but swearing the oath of allegiance to the Dáil was a different matter, and that was very patchy. It wasn't until April 1921 that the Dáil formally accepted responsibility for the IRA campaign. Local commanders, as I've said, were accustomed to making their own decisions and sourcing their own weapons, giving the people a lead. Now, I don't mean to reopen any sort of moralistic debate about Democrats versus dictators. I don't think that's helpful in understanding what was going on, but I do think it's worth emphasizing the fluid nature of authority and command during the War of Independence, which I think had important implications for conceptions of legitimacy in the fraught period after January 1922. Another important factor during the War of Independence was the very different experience of the northeast of Ireland. As I've already indicated, the pattern of violence was different there. It operated to a different pace, it had a different character, much more street violence, sniper activity, ethnic riots, inter-ethnic riots, as well as ambushes, lots of assassinations, and it had different protagonists, loyalist paramilitaries, some ancient order of Hibernian units, and after October 1920, the Ulster Special Constabulary, as well as police, Royal Irish Constabulary Police, and the IRA. And by the time the truce was declared, Ireland had already been formally partitioned by the Government of Ireland Act, and the new Northern Ireland Parliament had met for the first time. but violence was nonetheless continuing. I've already mentioned the violence of July 1921 in Belfast, but during the autumn of 1921, while the truce was notionally still in place, there was renewed outbreaks of serious violence in Belfast, and 1922, things deteriorate even further. And lastly, I just want to turn briefly to what we can say of public opinion in all of this. Now, certainly the results of the 1918 election were resounding, but the question has been asked whether this reflects a mandate from the Irish people for the IRA campaign. Although the intended abstention from Westminster was clear in the Sinn Féin manifesto, along with the plan to appeal to the Paris Peace Conference, there was no explicit declaration of an armed campaign. How could there have been? But this is not to say that it was not hinted at, and any politically literate person must have known or been able to guess what the reformed and rearming volunteer army was going to be used for. Nevertheless, while explicit mandate there was not, there is little evidence to support David Lloyd George's assertion that the Irish people were in the grip of a ruthless terroristic murder gang in the shape of the IRA. The local government election results in January and June 1920 saw Sinn Féin return an equally strong performance as they did in 1918, particularly the rural ones in June. And even with the partial handicap of proportional representation, Sinn Féin still controlled 86% of rural district councils across all of Ireland. Right across civil society, there was widespread trade union strikes in sympathy with the Republican movements, motions of sympathy and solidarity from councils, and the degree to which ordinary people actively participated in the alternative Dáil administration, particularly the Dáil courts, points to a degree of active support for the Republican campaign. And this support made it more and more impossible to make the sort of arguments David Lloyd George was making. By the time the truce was declared in July 1921, back-channel negotiations had been going on for some time between a group of hard-headed civil servants in Dublin Castle. These were generally ex-Treasury officials who kind of arrived in Dublin Castle after an overhaul of the personnel in the summer of 1920. So between those on one side and those who were perceived as moderates in Sinn Féin on the other side, and particularly Griffith and also De Valera. But moderates and pragmatists talking to each other was one thing, reaching public agreement on a settlement was another. And as the treaty negotiations began, some deep-seated potential obstacles were becoming clear. Next slide, please. The first was the degree of compromise already implicitly conceded by the decision to enter into negotiations. Short of forcing a British withdrawal, militarily impossible, a process of political negotiation resulting in some form of compromise was always going to be the end game. And the letter inviting De Valera to send a delegation to London, which you see on your screens there, contained the careful phrase to ascertain how the association of Ireland with the community of nations known as the British Empire may best be reconciled with Irish national aspirations. How, not whether. That implies a process of reconciliation, but this was not necessarily the message being given to IRA officers who were certain that one more push might secure the victory. The truce, registered as a military agreement with the League of Nations, was not the unconditional surrender the British had originally demanded. It wasn't even a conditional surrender. No weapons were surrendered at all. And there were renewed efforts by the IRA to import weapons during the summer of 1921. There were training camps established all over the country to bring new recruits, the Truciliers, up to scratch. All of this implying that a resumption of hostilities was imminent. And of course, this was arguably necessary in order to give the negotiators the strongest possible hand. But the shape of a future settlement had already caused one mini crisis within the Republican movement. De Valera, while on tour in the US, mused to an American reporter that Ireland's future relationship with Britain could be something akin to Cuba's relationship with the United States. And this provoked a flurry of outrage at home, and De Valera had to eat some humble pie in his correspondence with his cabinet. Of course, all of this begs the question as to why, if De Valera had acknowledged as far back as February as 1920 that some form of compromise short of a republic was likely, why he refused to support the treaty agreed in December 1921, but that's a question for later in the conference, perhaps. Sovereignty mattered on both sides, although I want to suggest that it was less an issue for the British than we might have thought. The integrity of the British Empire had long been mobilised as an argument against Irish nationalism, and Lloyd George in his September telegram similarly invoked it. The potential domino effect of Irish independence, particularly in the post-Versailles world, was undoubtedly a concern. Nevertheless, I think the degree to which British policy on Ireland moved over the space of 10 years, but even in the 18 months leading up to the opening of the negotiations, is worth remembering. Conservative politicians who flirted with civil war and threatened to overturn the principles of parliamentary democracy in Britain in opposition to a limited measure of devolution had by now supported Home Rule in the form of the Government of Ireland Act. In a major policy speech in October 1920, Lord George declared that Dominion Home Rule was not on the cards, not least for reasons of imperial defence and security. Yet this is essentially what was conceded in December 1921. And I think it's a mark of the enormous success of the Irish Republican project in the years after 1916 that it was able to push the British government to concede measures of sovereignty that had previously been unimaginable. At the same time, there is, of course, an anti-imperialist critique of the apparent flexibility and pragmatism of British policymaking vis-a-vis Ireland. And it is possible to interpret both partition and the belated concession of Dominion Home Rule as a sort of neo-colonial adjustment to a new global dispensation. Next slide, please. The position of Lloyd George within his own government is also worth considering. Although he was a long-standing supporter of Home Rule for Ireland, he was a minority Liberal Prime Minister with a Conservative cabinet, including some long-standing hawks on the Irish question, as well as the more mercurial Winston Churchill. James Craig, the leader of the Ulster Unionists, had been part of cabinet conferences on Irish policy for much of 1920 and 1921. Money, of course, mattered, and financial issues were another major problem to be unpicked, to be resolved. Pensions for public servants, the war debt, which was substantial, ongoing defence costs. But it's worth noting, I think, that this topic had been the subject of significant public debate during the third Home Rule crisis, with the financial parameters of what Home Rule meant explored by, among others, Erskine Childers, a member of the delegation, who I'm sure we'll hear more about later. So it would be interesting, I think, to compare some of the visions, the financial visions of what Home Rule would have meant with the financial realities of the Free State, and see, how much ground had really been gained from one to the other. Next slide, please. And this is my last point. Finally, perhaps most importantly, the question of partition also hung over the treaty negotiations, not least because the Northern Irish Parliament was already up and running. Taking a step back, there was a blunt logic, I think, to Lloyd George's manoeuvring during the Government of Ireland Act. It has been criticised by saying it solved a problem. No one was happy with it. It solved a problem which was already obsolete by the time it came into law. But in passing what was essentially a fourth Home Rule bill, making separate provision for Ulster Unionists, he was able to park the Ulster question before moving on to dealing with the rest of the Irish question via the treaty negotiations. The Sinn Féin position vis-a-vis the Government of Ireland Act was essentially to ignore it, and by extension to ignore the reality of unionist resistance. Just as partition had been imposed by London, the Republican reasoning went, so it could be overturned by London, and this actually was Irish policy for decades to come as well. And thus the 1921 negotiations were seen by Republicans as an opportunity to undo partition. One of the problems, though, for the Irish delegation was that the aspiration for maximum sovereignty and the aspiration for rolling back partition were incompatible, at least without the coercion of Ulster Unionists. And one of the great counterfactuals of Irish history is what would have happened if the Irish delegation had broken off negotiations on the question of partition. But that's for another day. So I hope that has set the stage a little for what is to follow, and I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caoimhe Dháibhéid is brilliant, and particularly a brilliant setting of the stage with your last few points about the what if, because of course that is the very big question. So for anybody who has just joined during your talk, well, first of all, you missed a great talk, but secondly, this is being recorded. Also, if you have questions, they go into the chat box and we deal with them after the second talk. So our second talk is being given by Dr. Sinéad McCoole. And Sinéad is a historian in the Commemorations Unit of the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media. Sinéad was one of the pioneers of the study of Irish women activists in the revolutionary period. Her monographs include Hazel, A Life of Lady Lavery, Guns and Chiffon, Women Revolutionaries and Kilmainham Jail, and No Ordinary Women, Irish Female Activists in the Revolutionary Years 1900 to 1923. Sinéad has also been active as a curator and a public historian throughout the decade of centenaries, including an RTÉ series of short films, Women of 1916. Dr. McCoole organized and led a Zoom conference on Muriel and Mary McSweeney's tour of America promoting Irish independence after my grandfather, Terence McSweeney's death. Of all the people that she would maybe be best to comment, might Countess Markovich or Mary McSweeney have made a difference if they had been asked to be at the negotiations in London? I'll leave that question for her if you'd like to address it. Sinéad serves on the government's expert advisory group on centenary commemorations and has done immense work on this body. Her talk today is titled, Negotiating, Did Women Have an Influence? Sinéad, over to you, my friend.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for the lovely introduction, Cathal. I'm going to, firstly, I'd like to start by saying thank you to UCD History Department for the invitation to speak. I note the healthy gender balance that in this conference and the titles of papers, indeed my own, I hope suggest a conference that will bring new insights into this topic. As for being part of the opening session, I thought that was particularly thought-provoking. I would be interested to hear if any of our participants and indeed the audience would think this would have been even considered as a paper a decade ago. Certainly to have given a paper on did women have an influence in the treaty negotiations would not have been looked at in my undergraduate years and indeed my postgraduate in modern Irish history. I'm delighted to be following the first speaker, Dr. Dháibhéid, and her comprehensive and engaging paper. I think, like her, I'd like to follow through and say it would have been a lovely opportunity to meet the participants. And again, I want to acknowledge Bernadette Whelan and Carol Fawcett, who are going to be speaking later on. So, and again, not just to speak to the women, but I just thought it was important because I wanted to celebrate UCC's gender balance again. We know of the role of women as administrators and secretaries to the treaty delegation. Indeed, thanks to the fine memoir, Kathleen Napoli McKenna, who makes up part of this descendants and who are going to inform this conference. And she's going to, I hope, feature many times in the papers over the next 2 days. But I want to look at the role of women whose part shaped events as they happened by their actions and maybe indeed by their inactions. And although, as Cathal has already drawn down, a place in the delegation was never offered to a woman, I am indeed going to reference in the second part of my talk both Mary McSweeney and Constance de Markovich. In my, I suppose, short presentation, I'm hoping to cover quite a lot of ground, and I want to acknowledge the contribution of women who have made this influence. I know that some of you out there won't be convinced at the end of my talk that they did have an influence, because what I'm going to suggest is not substantiated with documented material, and the lack of papers is always the thing that we find that we're up against when we're writing women into the history canon. So I wanted to make reference at the outset to two women whose story is an influence in relation to the treaty negotiations, but again, the difficulty is actually to flesh it out. I have indeed made contact with the descendants of Patricia Hoey in Australia in the hope of finding papers that I could use to be able to elicit more information on Patricia Hoey's role. We know from the military pensions record that she makes a fleeting reference to working with Arthur Griffith on papers to inform the contribution in the negotiations on the North. But again, it's only an aside in part of her submission, and we don't know any more than that. We also know of Moya Llewellyn-Davies' involvement, and indeed often it's her husband and his influence that is considered in the informing of the delegation, indeed Michael Collins, about the nature of the British negotiation team. But when we look at Moya and Patricia, both in detail, and I'm working on a book at the moment where I'm actually looking at these women and the role in the period that we've just listened to about in this period of the campaign of independence. And both of the women were involved in an administration level. And indeed, Moya was a paid speaker for the Women's Liberal Party and also the Women's Union, speaking at political rallies on issues like tax and budgets. While she was still Moya O'Connor in her 20s prior to her marriage to Crompton Llewellyn-Davies. So when we look at these women and we think about their contribution to the treaty negotiation, the actual, background to it, they're not working in the capacity as clerks or typing up the contents that are, they're creating the content. And this is what we need to look at in relation to this, looking at how women influence the treaty negotiations. But again, this is not part of the talk that I'm going to give. Then I also wanted to reference other work that I've done as part of my work for the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sports and the Media. And what I've been doing there is have been curating the McCoole 100 website, which has been really exciting because of the way that we're doing it. We're trying to use multimedia in order to tell these stories and bring in a wider audience to the history of this period. So what we've looked at in terms of looking at the White Cross and looking at the importance of that, which Caoimhe referenced earlier on, which is the international propaganda and all of the ways in which influential people across the world were assisting the Irish cause. And when we look at international women, when we think of people like Jane Addams on the Committee for the Conditions in Ireland, or Bessie Marbury in her involvement in the Committee in Relief in Ireland, these women were giants in their fields in America, hugely influential. And of course, Jane Addams is part of an international body of women. This is a part of a film called Toward America, which you can see on the McCoole100.ie website. And again, I'm just saying this out there to scholars, to people that are working in this area. This needs a lot of work, both in Ireland and in the US, in order to fully understand where these women's influence was on this period of negotiation with the British, where the Irish went into a negotiation with the leaders of the British Empire at this period in time, and this period in the aftermath of the war, in looking at women in peace negotiations and the influence that they had on Ireland. So I'm going to discuss in this paper the subject, which was my MA thesis. Sadly, I didn't know whether I should admit this, but it was 30 years ago this year, and the Laveries and their role in the emergence of the Irish Free State. I revisited it earlier this year as part of a catalogue essay for the National Museum's exhibition that's going to open shortly. My thesis was created in the early 90s, and it was approached in the way to look at salon politics and the art of the political hostess. This is in a time where the term lobbyist, the idea of what we call now the influencer, the indeed disruptors, were all present, but not defined in that same way. When we look at media, the way that the media was constructed, the way that language, the way that people spoke publicly is so different that often it doesn't lend itself to quotations within the academic work. It doesn't have the substance or gravitas that's necessary to convey something. So this different language and representation must always be factored in, particularly when we're dealing with somebody like Hazel Lady Lavery. And my second part of my talk, if I can cover that within the time space, is to look at a chapter that I did for the treaty book, which was published by the Irish Academic Press in 2019, which was entitled Debating, Not Negotiating, and looking at Mary McSweeney and Constance Markovich. So if I don't get to that in full details, I'd refer people to that article. So the understand the role of John and Hazel Lavery, I wasn't going to speak to slides, but some of you may know that my background is that my primary degree was history of art, and so I couldn't resist the temptation. So I'm going to show you and share the screen now and show you some images as I go through. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, so here we have an image of the king who we've already referred to earlier on. So on the 22nd of June 1921, King George V officially opened the House of Commons of Northern Ireland. And in his speech, we know he appealed to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation. And he followed it up with, that was followed up, of course, with the telegram that we just saw there to Eamon de Valera. So a decade earlier, his Majesty had gratefully and graciously permitted William Hugh Spottiswoode of Ayr and Spottiswoode, printers and chairman of the Spear and Tatler, to commission his friend John Lavery to paint the royal family portrait to present to the nation. So I'm just going to go back over that for 1 second and say his friend John Lavery, he runs the Spear and the Tatler. He's graciously permitted to allow John Lavery to paint this portrait of the royal family. But of course, for those of you who are familiar, you will know that this is not the complete family. They selected just 2 of their children, of their 5 children, to be included in this painting. The painter was given access to Buckingham Palace, and this is key to our story here. His idea for a grouping and sketch was pronounced satisfactory, and he was permitted to use the White Drawing Room as a studio. They showed considerable interest in this portrait, and indeed afterwards the friendship continued through John Lavery's involvement in Irish affairs. The Queen actually purchased a painting in a public gallery of one of his works later on. He was commissioned later on to include royal portraits in her dollhouse. I'm not going to go into detail, I could get carried away here, but I just want to continue and emphasize that he didn't lose any of his royal patronage because of his involvement in the treaty negotiations, which is interesting. And so the Princess of Wales was there, would have had individual time, but the King and Queen visited Lavery's studio in their house 5 Cromwell Place, which featured, of course, as the location for the dinners and the informal communication in the period of the negotiations that we're now discussing. So in March and April of 1913, they went to see the work in progress, and this was picked up in the press and made much of. The reason that they focused on the Laverys in this period in time was the fact that John's American wife was very easy and able to mix with royalty. And of course, this whole thing of the informal nature of Americans in London society, being able to host neutral gatherings was very important to remember. And so here, this is an image of the studio. They had the top floor of the house was a studio, and this is where they entertained. And this became something that was featured in Vogue and Ladies Pictorial. And so the artist's studio, of course, and this is just part of the large painting that you may be familiar with in the National Gallery of Ireland, which shows John Lavery's American wife, Hazel Martin Trudeau, her daughter Alice, his own daughter in secondary position, the Moorish maid, John Lavery seeing himself as in Velasquez mode, but also included in this in the background is the sketch of the Queen. So it's a very much a sort of almost like a homage to his family, but also showing his status and his importance at this time for all of his clients. So here we have this woman who within sort of 10 years, becomes a hostess and mixing and involved in Irish affairs. She's saying that she's Irish American, but I'm not sure how much she knows. I now know that she had no Irish blood. I think she probably knew that herself, but at this time, sort of came to embrace the Irishness that her husband had as a Belfast-born man. But they were at this stage international. So just moving quickly along here, her fame had increased following her marriage in 1909. She was well known for her fashion. She was photographed, and these would have been circulated to German and other European magazines. But on a sort of a note, John Lavery, who's now sort of in 2013 was 47. He had considerable standing in the international world, in membership of the Royal Academy, the Hibernian Academy, the Royal Scottish Academy, the Academies of Rome, Antwerp, Milan, Brussels, Stockholm. He had friendships with the leading artists of the day. He had been vice president of the International Society of Sculptors, Painters, and Engravers. And he was awarded honours such as the Cavalier Crown of Italy. He had been involved. He had 53 works in the Venice Biennale. So in artistic terms, he's a megastar. And that's sometimes played down because particularly if you look at his own source material, which I borrowed heavily from in the early years, his autobiography, he almost makes himself a caricature of what he was himself. And that's part of, I think, where the sort of distorted lens of the Laverys has been, even indeed with my own work. So the value of their neutrality, the importance of him with his international standing, and their friendships at the time. I mean, the Churchills were close friends. Hazel Lavery had taught Winston Churchill to paint, and these things are significant in moving in that circle. But they also were, even though John was a liberal, he had they were hosted by the Asquiths when he was prime minister, but they also attended conservative parties that were hosted by the Londonderrys, who were considered close friends. So the way that we have them seen when they enter into Irish affairs is almost untouchables. This is just an image that I wanted to show that they did shock. They did court a sort of degree of controversy when Hazel posed as the Madonna in the tableau vivants at the First World War, and then John painted her for a triptych that he gave to the church in which he was baptized in Belfast, which is still there to this day. And so these people were always seeking the limelight, because they were using their fame and to ensure their fortune. Because Hazel, although her family had been wealthy, she didn't bring money to the marriage, and then John Lavery continued to paint in order to maintain a lifestyle. So when he decides to paint, Carson and Redmond, he does so, offering it at the time for the Irish War Hospital Depot of the British Red Cross Society. So he's supporting the war effort. And then within 3 weeks of the 1916 Rising, he paints a blank portrait that's now has never been located, that he offered to paint a portrait in exchange for a donation to support the widows and dependents in the aftermath of the Rising. So when he comes to paint the trial of Roger Casement, it is not motivated from an interest in Ireland, but it's to do with painting the passing of a death sentence, or so it seems. And when the press report, and I quote, "Girls in white, girls on sand in full sun, or girls on horseback, such used to be Lavery's themes, but the penalty of fame has brought him on the other subjects, including a coronation and a trial. Of all trials not to paint, the Casement trial I should have thought would be first in place." So he was going to damage his reputation by painting this scene. for years I thought that the lady in the gallery was Lady Lavery. This is the original sketch that he did, and then the larger version that he painted afterwards was removes the gallery. Lady Lavery attended with Charles Beresford. Again, the idea that she's attending with somebody from the other side is significant and noted indeed by Casement. But in other letters, it suggests that this was Eva Gore-Booth, but he couldn't get a sitting with her. His way of producing works at the time was to have individual portrait sittings with all these people, and so he networked and had significant people within his life. Now I'm going into far too much detail in relation to it, so I will move quickly along. And this is the final version of the large painting, which is now on loan to King's Inns. So what was he doing in the War of Independence that's been so ably described by Caoimhe? Well, he was traveling around painting his Irish collection, painting, this is Cardinal Michael Lowe. He painted the Protestant Archbishop. They do this tour of Ireland that was detailed by Lord Winborne. They are supposedly looking for the elusive Michael Collins. Well, I think that with a more mature reflection of what they're doing is that their correspondings with Churchill about the situation in Ireland, in a letter that John includes in his autobiography, but at the same time, they're making connections. And indeed, material that's been recently digitized in the National Library from Desmond Fitzgerald's papers suggests that they were visiting in Harcourt Street to the publicity department at the time when we know that Eileen McGrain was meeting a lot of sort of society ladies, and she's not mentioned by Eileen McGrain, but others are. And so the idea being that they're again setting the scene for what they're going to do with the treaty delegation and onwards. And so, as I've already mentioned, Winston Churchill is a friend. So as Lavery places himself at the centre of Irish affairs, trying to record this Irish collection that's now, between the galleries of Belfast and Dublin in the Hugh Lane and the Dublin City Gallery. It's interesting to note that it was a great cover for their activities, and that's how he started to paint the negotiators who came over first, Eamon de Valera. When Count Plunkett is visiting in July, they start the dinners. Hazel has met Hugh Kennedy at that stage. And she writes to Arthur Griffiths. She sends another letter to Desmond Fitzgerald in Dublin, asking can she continue on with these dinners and these activities. She has a note in her own scrapbooks of having meetings. Now, the one of the people that Churchill rushed over to meet at the Lavery's house was Eddie Marsh. And then also we know that Andy Cope later on used their houses as a centre for discussions. We have others like Churchill's first cousin, Shane Leslie of Glasslough Monaghan, who is also used as a sort of a messenger, as he describes himself at this particular time. So it's important to note that they were liaising with Sinn Féin in the period in the run up to this. And then, of course, it's again interesting that Collins comes to the house directly. Of course, this is said by John Lavery to be because of Hanny Collins and Hanny Collins's influence there that brings him to the house, not the official way in which they're negotiating and talking to the Irish, officially through the offices in Hans Place. And so here we have Collins arriving in the middle of November. When we think about the conference and what point that is in the conference, it's quite late on. So whatever meetings and informal dinners that are having, they're in the period November and into December, and they were quite, and it has to have been quite frequent. And so the idea that Collins is attending all the time, that he's meeting her at Brompton Oratory, this is Lady Lavery, who had converted to Catholicism. All of those referencing are in the sort of gossipy way in which it was discussed later on. This particular image that was reproduced and sold by Lavery, signed by Collins, and the same by Griffith, again the commercial side of Lavery, is Michael Collins's portrait as it was painted, and it is believed to have been given to Kitty Kiernan, and no trace of it has been found. So this is the portrait that he painted. And what I think is important here is that Collins very quickly sees the value of the Laverys, but we're looking all the time at how John is telling the story, or somebody else of that nature, not in a way in which there's an analysis of them as actual players and negotiators, and what side are they working from. I mean, again, I hope that will be something that will be discussed as the conference goes on. So this is a portrait that was painted of Andy Cope later on, and some of you may be familiar with the Bureau of Military History letter where Cope is writing and refusing to give his side and being quite angry, and yet the correspondence with the Laverys is quite gushing. Indeed, Winston Churchill opens a joint exhibition by John and Hazel Lavery in October of 1921, and again in his speech, public speech reproduced in the newspapers and in a catalogue, he's so gushing about Lady Lavery. It speaks to him speaking publicly about his close relationship with the Lavery at this critical and sensitive period. And so when we talk about the meetings in the houses, and I'll skip along here now ahead, in terms of it, is that we know that by the 1st of December, the British had handed over their final proposals, a Dominion status for Ireland, similar to Canada, and the use of terms, and they're being brought back and forth. And then we're talking really early on, in 4th of December, where Collins comes in. So I'm going to get to the nub of what is the story that is the Lady Lavery's influence, and that is that she drove Collins to Downing Street for his critical meeting with Lloyd George. And again, the story that went out from in society through Clemmy Churchill was that she wore her favorite opera coat. And again, with a degree of reluctance, I sort of looked out the idea that I would include a piece from Barbara Cartland's memoir, where she discusses it, and she talks about it in it's a memoir called We Danced All Night, and she talks about how Lady Lavery, the influence of the petticoat, and so it's the nature of the source material that is the difficulty with the Lavery story. And of course we know that John continued his Irish collection and painted then later on the passage of the legislation. And these paintings were then shared again between various collections. And of course, Laverys are always going to be seen by their influence in terms of the image of Ireland, the currency. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about there in relation to the, in terms of what I've been talking about here, is that when we see something, an image, the influence of Lady Lavery in relation to even becoming replacing the monarch on the currency is always seen through the lens of being something almost like an aside. And I think that what we have learned over the last 30 years is that these are just signposts to something wider, deeper, and more important. And so I'm going to move on now to the second part of my sort of referencing to the idea of both Mary McSweeney and Constance de Markovich as potentially somebody who was going to be in the treaty, as somebody there to broker a deal. In later years, Mary McSweeney told a friend that when she asked Eamon de Valera to be part of the delegation, he replied that she was too extreme. This comes from Oisin McCone's book 1987. Eamon de Valera gives no indication of this when he wrote of her to Joseph McGarrity on the 27th of December 1921. Miss McSweeney, I would have liked to see facing Lord George across the table, not merely because of her own personality and her political ability, but Lord George could not fail to see beside her the spirit of her dead brother. That's a document that's in the National Library. Mary McSweeney had written to De Valera from Philadelphia on the 20th of July 1921, the day that he set out for London for the first negotiations that he had himself with the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. It is now nearly 8 months, she wrote, since I took up at your special request the task of touring this country. And in view of the possible new developments, I want to write to you for further orders. I feel very strongly that Lord George is being very clever man in view of England's big troubles all over the world. The wisest course for her government would be to acknowledge our republic at once and make friends with us. Whether he can pursue the Tories to agree with him or not remains to be seen. In the same letter, she told De Valera that she would oppose a settlement if there was any chance that there should be a question of putting the matter before the country. I shall take the first boat home and add my voice to no surrender side. At the first stage of negotiations, she had defined her position, and she concluded her letter, as for having done my bit, the plea is out, of course, for none of us can be said to have done our part fully till Ireland is free or we are dead. If I leave here, it will be only to be able to do something at home, and the question is where I can be of most use. I do not ask for any option in the matter, being, I hope, as good a soldier as the next. In 1926, P.S. O'Hegarty published a personal exchange between himself and Mary McSweeney, again in his victory of Sinn Féin. This took place when she had returned from her speaking tour in the United States. He reproduces his conversation in which he admonishes Mary McSweeney for thinking that De Valera would achieve a republic. He told her, use your own intelligence, and she replied that she thought Eamon de Valera would achieve a semi-independent connection with England that we could accept. This published exchange was written at a time when both Eamon de Valera and Mary McSweeney were outside Dáil Éireann. It has to be assessed as a pro-treaty view on a past conversation with an opponent who was still a threat to the stability of the state. It is important, however, to see it as a more compromising depiction of Mary McSweeney at this juncture, in contrast to her delivery at the treaty debates when she reverted to her desire for a full republic in the public session on the 21st of December 1921. And she told the delegates a different story. But I know that in this conference, we want not to focus on what happens in the treaty debates, but focus on the negotiations. So I think that while it's tempting to always look at the longer lens, to look at the woman who may have selected and accepted document number 2, I think that what's really important here is that the women who assessed Mary McSweeney at this particular point, and one of them being Jenny Wise Power, who, as we know, been a leader of the Ladies' Land League, early involvement in Sinn Féin, Poor Law Guardian, I can go on, but somebody whose political nous and political acumen was there. She describes Mary McSweeney on the 22nd of February 1922 as the virtual leader, and that Eamon de Valera is completely in her hands. And again, it just throws up another discussion around Mary McSweeney. And if she had been included in the treaty delegation, what would have happened? Now, as historians, we're not into the what ifs, but what I want people to consider here is the influence that women had on the treaty negotiations by virtue of the fact that they weren't sitting at the negotiation table. Countess de Markovich also expresses her desire to be part of the negotiation teams, and she cited a fuller understanding of the English because of her upbringing and family links during the public sessions on the 3rd of January 1922. She actually said at those debates, "Why didn't you send me? I tell you, don't trust the English with their gifts in their hands. I tell you, you will come out of this a defeated nation. I am pledged as a rebel, an unconvertible rebel, because I am pledged to one thing of free and independent Ireland." And so what's really important to remember in the longer lens for Mary McSweeney in particular is the fact that the second Dáil continued, the second Dáil Éireann, which had a huge influence and was reproduced in the press and had links then in right into the 1940s in what happens next. And so when we look at how our female politicians have been described, eccentrics, disreputable, and now the well-known phrase from Margaret Ward's book, Unmanageable Revolutionaries, I want you to think again of women and their involvement and their influence on the treaty delegation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Sinead. That was a tour de force. Thank you both. Thank you also, Caoimhe. I think that you really have opened things up, because the women's story was a story that needed to be told then, but is now being told now. And particularly, I like the fact that we've inherited cartoon versions of, whether it's of Mary McSweeney or other people, which we knew were not necessarily the case. And so absolutely fascinating. I'd like to open to questions to anybody who's maybe doing it through the chat box. We had a point from Delita Clancy, who's one of the people involved in the group that has organized all of these events. And she says very interesting talks, particularly about the library paintings of Griffith, accompanied by others from the delegation. Griffith was accompanied by others from the delegation to view the portraits on their last day in London before departing for Dublin, a crucial cabinet meeting of the 8th of December. So that's something from the Fawcett Diary in 1921 in the Cork Archives. And I should say that the primary movers in this conference were the Fawcett family, and there was Dermot Fawcett Cork, who was in the background at the very start of the movement in Cork and was there right through to the whole thing. So any questions that anybody wants to ask, we have just 15 minutes, and so they would have to put the questions into the chat box. And so maybe I would just make one little point, which was interesting about with regards to the first talk from Caoimhe, where she mentions that on the very first day that the dog started, we had Dháibhéid, and Cathal Brugha have reorganized the army, and were actually organized the Irish Republican Army in 1917, but in 1919, January, they had the first meeting of Dáil Éireann, and on the same time in Dháibhéid, Dan Breen and Sean Tracy carried out the first action of the War of Independence. But Cathal Brugha's point was that they had no authority because the government hadn't been set up, and he wanted to court-martial them, and he was restrained from doing that by saying, well, they're here down in Tipperary, so you can't really be critical of them. So things were quite confusing and quite difficult setting things up. I would refer to anybody to the Manal 100 website, because that's a fascinating website, and there are a lot of other people that have been mentioned, but let's see if there are any questions coming in. Well, I think people are being very good. So we have a question here, very interesting, Sinead, on the issue of influence, informal communication, gossip, etc. Another important woman is Alice Stopford Green, who engaged in proto-diplomacy, or diplomacy that is in search of a state. I've recently co-authored an essay on this aspect of the ASG's Activism and Influence, Women's History Review 2021. Could you speak a little bit more about the methodological challenges when tracing gossip?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the question. And indeed, thank you to alerting me to that article, and I'll look to that. I would say to you that we're in an amazing sort of renaissance of people working in the field, and so there's between the primary material that's being digitized at such a rate, and also the work of male and female historians in this area. I mean, I think what it is what I really wanted to refer to is, I suppose, is that back to my when I was doing my my own thesis in university, and I think I sort of maybe hinted that several times in the talk, is that the type of sources was almost influencing the nature of it being an academic piece, because the source material was coming from the sort of you know, these memoirs that were, you know, popular, that were, you know, written for a different, you know, a different audience. And so the main difficulty is having, you can sort of even see the different tone in the way that I gave my presentation, when you have the quotations from the letters of Mary McSweeney, to the contrast to the types of material that I was quoting for the Laveries. And I suppose what it is that we now have a fuller understanding that something that appeared to be a trivialization, it's really a reread of this material, and a highlighting of trying to weave this material in that hints to a wider story. And I think that maybe by highlighting Patricia Hoey and the biography of these women is so important in understanding how they inform, and how those references, what those references mean. So Patricia Hoey was working in, you know, in Collins's intelligence network. She was working in the Sinn Féin movement with Arthur Griffith, and all of those references suggest that they were informing the thinking and informing the way in which things were approached, but they weren't acknowledged. And we know that in the stories of the time, they were removed, and you can see that so clearly in the retelling, and particularly of the stories of the War of Independence by some of them of the men who were in, let's say, Collins's network. I'm thinking in particular of somebody like Bat O'Connor's version of my, you know, his work with Mike Collins.
Very good. When you're putting in your questions, just if you put your name in, because in some cases people want to keep their name out of the question, but that was from Quillen back on. Erskine Childers has a question, and Erskine Childers is a very significant person because of the first Erskine Childers, who was one of the people at the conference, and then his son was the president, and his grandson then was in the UN, and now Erskine Childers said the fourth is actually on the group, but he's from America. He says, wonderful talks, many thanks. I have a question for Dr. McCoole. How do you view Shane Leslie's involvement with the Laveries and the treaty?
Shane Leslie was attempting to write a biography of Lady Lavery, and he was prevented by her daughter from doing so. I'm slightly coloured by the interviews that we had with Alice Gwynn. You know, albeit I was in my 20s and she was 86, and I didn't have the knowledge that I have now in order to ask proper questions. But I really got the impression from her that he had manipulated a little bit the nature of the source material, and the material that's in Kilmainham jail that was found on Collins's body, that was given to Hazel Lavery by back to Hazel Lavery by Hanny Collins. It was donated by Shane Leslie's widow. So what I would say to you about Shane Leslie is that a lot of what he writes is it's in the Georgetown archive, and I used it extensively when I was looking at my Lady Lavery biography. It's written in a very flowery way, and what's interesting is to compare and contrast his own version of an event in his diary, and then see how he manipulated the story again in terms of when he writes his own memoir. So I suppose it's back down to drilling back through an analysis of who's writing when, for what audience, and how the nature of somebody having the Lavery story, and Lady Lavery had already, you know, entered into the consciousness in a particular way because of what happened next. And so he was able to use what he, you know, that information to again talk about himself and his importance in various events.
Next question: was there much gossip in the Irish and British newspapers about the delegates' activities in London?
No, it's not. No, that's not what I'm finding. Initially, I would have been looking at the collection of Lady Lavery herself, when she would have had a cutting service and she would have had made her own scrapbooks up of her mentions in the newspaper. So in my book, that I wrote all those years ago, it was her archive that I was using. I've gone back again now because of all the digitization, trying to go back through the newspapers to try and find those references. But it's very much the referencing to them of where they're still attending, who they're still mixing with in that period in time, in terms of London society, the amount of MPs and different things that I've really looked at. It's not really in the sort of gossip around the delegation. It's who they're speaking to and who they're seen publicly with. I'm very interested in now.
Next question from Dermot Manning. Excellent discussion so far. Another one of note is my great aunt Kathleen McKenna, whose work on the Irish Bulletin during the War of Independence was very important in helping the first Dáil in the propaganda war with the British. Kathleen was also in London for the treaty negotiations. That's just a comment. Next question, because they're now coming in quickly, and we've got just about 5 minutes more. From Pat Savage, did the increase in casualties from 1919 to 1922 affect an increase in support for the war or an increase in the military response? What effect did that increase have on support? What effect did that have by July 1921? Could the campaign have continued? Difficult one to take.
Caoimhe, do you want to do that?
Sorry, yeah, I'm sorry about that. My internet crashed. So if I heard the question correctly, it was about the increase in casualties, what that represents. Yes. What that means.
Yes. Did it cause an increase in support for the war or an increase in the military response? What effect did it have, the increase in casualties? Could the campaign have continued?
Well, I think there's a dialectic, right? There's a dialectic between the one. It's hard to separate out these different things. So you have increased casualty, a more heavy-handed response. There are some areas like County Galway, I think, is a good example, which gets a very heavy-handed response in 1920, and IRA activities in Galway actually decreased by quite a bit in that winter of 1920. And you know, there's the infamous case of the pregnant woman breastfeeding her baby who is shot by black and tans firing off their weapons as they drive along the streets near Gort, I think, in County Galway, and IRA activities go down in County Galway. So you can say, is it the case that, you know, a heavy-handed military response has the desired effect in terms of kind of smothering, crushing the IRA? But across the whole of the country, you can't separate out what's happening in Galway from what's happening in Cork, from what's happening in Clare. And I think increased casualties just breeds more violence. So you have the cycle of reprisal and counter-reprisal and assassination and more reprisals. So I don't think, if I've understood the question correctly, I don't think that increased casualties deaden popular support. Quite on the contrary, actually. I think it makes the legitimacy of the British position untenable. If you're having, you know, Crown forces going around destroying towns and villages, as well as, you know, extrajudicial executions, the moral authority of the Crown is just fatally undermined if it ever had any, you know, at the outset.
Okay, question from Mervyn O'Driscoll. Caoimhe mentioned the international portrayal of the revolution as a factor in how the War of Independence was conducted and perhaps in impelling negotiations. To what extent did that restrain British strategy and tactics, do you think?
That's a good question. I mean, I think certainly the British politicians and some people at the head of policing, British policing in Ireland are alarmed by what seems to be a situation spiraling out of control in the winter of 1920. And there is an attempt to draw that back a bit. And certainly, you know, the pictures of Cork that went around the world, I mean, that was just really, really damaging. And there is a sense that the moral authority, as I've said, is being lost. And, you know, some of the Mark Sturgis, who was a colleague of Andy Cope that Sinead talked about earlier, one of these kind of new pragmatic civil servants in Dublin Castle. He writes in his diary, he's quite frustrated by the burnings, by reprisals, and he says, a little less burning and a little more shooting is what's required. So he's not opposed to executions full stop, but he thinks that the kind of mass collective punishment is really counterproductive. And the kind of the burning and the sacking of towns that we see in the winter of 1920, that does diminish into 1921. So I think it does have an effect. Yeah, I think there is a change.
I'm just aware that we're running out of time, and I think we have to be disciplined. But question from Jerry White: would Dr. Nick Dháibhéid like to comment on the role of the Irish Republican Brotherhood in the war, and also about the tensions that existed between the IRB members and the non-members within the Republican movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really difficult and controversial aspect. I mean, there are certainly, as we know, the IRB were at the heart of planning for the Rising. They were, the secret organization that had, infiltrated and helped to recruit to the volunteers. But Eamon de Valera was a member of the IRB, and he left the organization because he felt, as we move into a new phase with Sinn Féin, and an open campaign, the time for secret societies is over. And I think your grandfather might have left the IRB around the same time, possibly as well. You'll correct me if I'm wrong on that, Cathal.
He insisted on leaving. January 1919, he said there should be no more IRB, no more secret societies. It should be all under the Dáil.
Absolutely. That there's a new kind of democratic moment, and therefore there's no need for secret societies anymore. But we do know that the IRB continue. We know that they are, they're heavily overrepresented in IRA GHQ, for example, and at some senior levels, in the command structures out in the country as well. So I think there's a story to be told there. I mean, John Regan has written a little bit about the role of the IRB in understanding what Collins is doing as we get from the treaty through to the Civil War, and the attempt maybe to avert the Civil War by focusing attention up to the north of Ireland as well. So I think it's an area that would merit further study. It seems very complicated, very hard to unpick. There's various kind of accusations, and I don't want to say conspiracy theories, because I don't think that's right. There's theories in the IRB were themselves a conspiracy. So I think there needs to be some more work done on that, if it's possible to do it with the papers.
Okay, last question, because we'll be going to a 15-minute break before we start the next session, and it's some Fiona Brennan. Thank you so much for such wonderful papers. Is it possible that Muriel McSweeney in particular, or Maureen Cregan, figure in the fascinating conversation about women? And apologies to the 14 new messages that we're not going to be coming to, because this is going to be the last one. Quick comment from either or both of you?
I think that's for Sinead.
Yeah, I just think, I think that in terms of just to take Maureen Cregan, and I think somebody made a mention there as well in looking at Lily O'Brien. I think the thing with it is that if you trace all the interconnections between the different families and where people are meeting and all of that, so Lily O'Brien's house would have been where Robert Barton would have been living during the period in the run up to the treaty negotiations. The connections are so strong, if you know what I mean. And the women who were selected for the delegation were so able, and they were many years activists and trusted. So I think that's the important point. And also that someone with Maureen Cregan is now married into the massive and important family of the Ryans of Tom Coole, and marrying Jim Ryan. So I mean, again, just that connection there is significant. But again, it's the importance of the referencing within the letters. It's the throwaway remarks that lead us to something else, and a little bit like what Caoimhe was talking about there with the IRB. The same complexity is with the role of women during this period. It's the same level of secret negotiations and secret communications, and that's why it's a difficult story to tell.
Okay, listen, thank you very much, both of you. The women have shown incredible leadership in this session, and we're really much appreciated. There 142 people participating with 18 new questions, but I'm going to have to do the cruel thing and stop everything now. So you can go and take your quick cup of coffee and your quick sandwich and get ready for the next session, which will be starting shortly. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Gur
Thank
Malga.
you. Have a nice long.